Tanking in Final Fantasy is no joke. There's a lot of things expected of you, from making sure that you're holding all the aggro to making sure you're mitigating as much damage as possible for yourself and your party members, as well as maximizing uptime. There's doing as much DPS as possible, knowing your ideal openers, and making sure you're positioning people in the correct way, and knowing the mechanics of the fight. All of those things are expected of you if you are a good tank within the game. So this guide will teach you how to do all of those things. Let's dive in. Do you see what I'm doing here? Tank stance. Tank stance is incredibly important, and it isn't always on when you enter a dungeon or a raid, so make sure that you turn on tank stance. Tank stance is obviously going to help you generate enmity, so you need to have it on if you want to hold aggro. Otherwise, your party's not going to like you very much. So turn on tank stance and pretty much leave it on always. There is some weird circumstances where you turn it off, we'll discuss that later, but for now, tank stance on all the time. Something you'll want to make sure when you're in dungeons is AOE spam. In order to generate aggro effectively on many monsters at a time, you want to be spamming your AOEs. The other nice little benefit of this is that it is generally your best DPS option as you're running through dungeons. For most classes, if there's like 3 monsters on the board, spamming your AoEs will be your highest DPS option versus single targeting enemies, and it gets the benefit of holding aggro on everyone nice and tight. If you're going through dungeons, a few AoE spam is honestly all you need to keep aggro on a mob the entirety of the pull, but if you're trying to just maximize DPS, which you absolutely should, then spamming AoEs is pretty much always the best option if there's 3 or more enemies on the board. Spam them AoEs. Do you see this nice little section on my hotbar down here? These are my tanking cooldowns. These are something that are not just used when you think you're gonna die, these are something that you should be using preemptively pretty much constantly. The recast timers on these are very varied, but I, at least as a gunbreaker, get one that can be recast every 25 seconds, so that one should pretty much always be on. When you're doing a big dungeon pull, you should always have at least 1 or 2 of these popped. If you see that you're taking an aggressive amount of damage, don't be afraid to pop even more cooldowns. Your healer will very much appreciate you mitigating damage so you don't have to be emergency healed from near death. On top of this, when you're doing a boss fight, even if you're using your cooldowns in the dungeon pulls, I promise you that they will be up in time for when you need them during the boss fight, so don't be afraid to be using your cooldowns during the actual pulls. During the boss fight, if you know there's a tank buster coming, you will obviously need to be popping potentially more than 1 of these. Depends on what kind of fight you're doing. In a dungeon boss, a regular 1 cooldown will be fine. But if you're doing a raid, for instance, you might have to pop 2 or 3 of these at a time just to mitigate the damage of the single tank buster. So know what level of content you're in. For dungeon pulls, you don't have to be as aggressive. In raid mechanics, certainly savage raid mechanics, you might have to be popping a lot of these to survive certain abilities. On top of this, know that there's raid-wide mitigation that every tank class gets access to in Reprisal. Reprisal is something that is going to help you take less damage across the entire raid for a certain period of time. Also with the Gunbreaker class, for instance, I get access to another ability which is doing raid-wide mitigation. So these are abilities you want to save if you know that everyone's going to be hit regardless. Your healer will very much appreciate you popping these before those mechanics, so that way they don't have to heal as aggressively. So use your cooldowns. Positioning is something that's incredibly important when you're tanking, and I'm not talking necessarily about your own positioning during mechanics, I'm talking much more about holding your targets in the proper position. Obviously, when it comes to your melee DPS, they care about positionals. Positionals, if you're not familiar, means that they're trying to hit certain abilities from the back or from the side, and in order for them to do that, the mobs can't be dancing all over the place, otherwise hitting their positionals is going to be next to impossible. So your melee DPS are going to severely appreciate you if you try and hold your mobs as still as humanly possible. Make sure that they have access to both the sides and the back if at all possible when you're doing pulls. So if there's an enemy right up against a wall, try and turn it in a way so that way its back and sides are visible. But don't move a bunch is the key point during this thing, is allow your melee DPS to hit their positionals, which will increase the overall DPS, which will make your fights go even faster, increase your survivability, allow your healer to have to heal for a less amount of time. Everybody wins if you position things correctly and don't move around a bunch. When it comes to bosses, understanding where the best place to hold them is also important. If you're doing just a regular dungeon and you don't happen to remember it, always try and point the boss away from your party as a standard rule of thumb. And on top of this, again, don't move. Don't constantly be jittering all over the place if you can avoid it. Dodge all the mechanics that you can, of course, but don't just move for the sake of moving. If you've got a boss locked and facing a certain direction, just leave it there. As you get later into the game, there's a lot of things that tanks do as best practices as far as facing the boss north every single time, so the DPS will always be south. That is something that you can try and build into your repertoire as you get more advanced in your tanking career. But at a minimum for this section of the video, just know that you want to not move a bunch when you have all of the aggro from the enemies. Your melee DPS will love you oh so much. Now that you have a pretty good handle on using your cooldowns properly, positioning mobs appropriately, holding aggro, turning on your tank stance, you also have to do damage. Your job as a tank isn't just to hold the boss and position him correctly, you also have to do damage. So doing some research on what your ideal openers are against bosses, understanding how to maintain uptime on bosses is very important. Also, making sure you know your ideal rotation is very important. This is something that you should be doing constantly as you're going through your fights. Again, as we talked about before, doing AOE damage pretty much constantly when there's 3 or more enemies on the screen is almost always the most effective DPS option. When it comes to single target, there's tons of sites that you can use to look up your ideal rotation. Literally, if you just go into YouTube and type in your class and rotation, you will find videos that will show you what your class's ideal rotation is. On top of that, you could even go as far as going to a site like The Balance, for instance, which will show you what your best in slot gear is, so you're optimizing your DPS on top of the fact that you're just doing all your fun tanking stuff. But again, you need to be doing maximum DPS, which requires knowing your openers, knowing your rotation, maintaining uptime, wearing the appropriate gear, and slotting in the appropriate materia. All of that stuff is just the icing on the cake when it comes to tanking. The last thing we'll cover is the concept of main tanking versus off tanking. Main tanking is literally everything that we've discussed in this video, so doing your job as we've described so far is main tanking. Off tanking, alternatively, is the idea that you are not the main tank, but you are basically in a pure DPS role and you're on standby to become the main tank. There's a lot of dungeons and raids and savage content, ultimate content, extreme content, where tank swaps are required, or potentially your main tank just dies and you need to step in. So when you are in off tank mode, there's a couple things you should be aware of. One is that your tank stance should generally be off. The last thing you want to do when you're the off tank is randomly pull aggro off of the main tank. So in order to ensure this doesn't happen, you keep your tank stance off. If you'd like to start to generate aggro, but not necessarily go all in on aggro, you could just delay turning on your tank stance, wait a reasonable amount of time, and then turn on your tank stance, so that way the main tank has the priority. They have way more aggro than you do, but you are generating a lot after the fact. This is another strategy you could do. But in general, when you're off tanking, your tank stance should not be on, or at a minimum, it should be delayed. On top of this, you need to have provoke on your hotbar. Remember that ability provoke that you probably haven't touched for your entire leveling experience so far? That is suddenly incredibly important. So if you are swapping into the main tank, whether that's for a tank buster or your main tank died, there's a couple things you need to do. One is make sure that your tank stance is on, so if it wasn't before, it needs to be now. And the second thing is to provoke. You need to immediately get aggro on that boss, and that boss is only going to do that if you provoke. The reason you want to provoke, of course, is because you don't want the boss randomly smacking everybody else in the raid. More than likely, they can't handle more than a hit or two, whereas you can stand there like the tank that you are and survive everything. So your melee DPS, again, will not have the boss moving all over the place, so they're missing all their positionals. The healers aren't going to like magically get all lost and confused trying to heal everybody. You need to pull the aggro immediately and quickly, which is why you use provoke, and your tank stance is on, which means you're going to hold it after that fact. You should also position yourself where the main tank was. So if they were facing the boss a certain way, you should provoke and move to where they were. So that way, again, the positionals for your melee DPS can maintain their maximum effectiveness, as it were. So Off tank transitioning to main tank, make sure that your tank stance is turned on if it wasn't before, and you're provoking, and you're swapping to where the main tank used to be standing. Key things to do when you're transitioning. If you're the main tank and you're transitioning to the off tank, basically the opposite is true. So the opposite of provoke is shirk. So when you're shirking somebody, which will always be your off tank in this scenario that's swapping into the main tank, you shirk them, which then transfers a bunch of the aggro you're generating onto them, and then you're also turning off your tank stance. This will ensure that the boss is not going to randomly retarget you after the fact once you've made this switch. You need to make sure that the person that is becoming the new main tank stays the main tank and you don't randomly grab it for all the exact reasons we just discussed why you'd want to be off tanking the way you are. So shirk is an ability that will ensure that if you're swapping off main tank, your off tank is going to stay the target. So off tank, make sure you provoke, make sure your tank stance is on, make sure you move to where the old main tank was. If you're the main tank, then make sure that you are turning off your tank stance and you are shirking your off tank so they can become the new main tank. Hopefully that all made sense. I think I said the word tank 75,000 times there, but it is incredibly important to understand this concept to be very effective in Savage Ultimate Extreme content. You're gonna need to know how to do all that stuff. So hopefully this primer was useful to you. Now that you've watched this video guide, you can call yourself a pro tank. If you do everything I said, of course. That's everything I've got for you in this video. Hopefully you found it useful. I'll be making more guides like this in the future, of course, for the other archetypes within the game, and all those other fun Final Fantasy XIV videos that I'll be making in the future. So I'd love it if you gave it a subscribe, or a like, or a comment, preferably all the above, but who cares, you do you. I love you guys as always. I'll see you in a future video. I'll see you next time.